Hola, scholars. Today we're looking at queer graphic history, and specifically we're looking at the pages that start with, understandings are always contextual, page 18. It has this great graphic there. And then we go until page 58 with the topic heading of subjectivity. So with that being said, this selection of readings actually pairs very nicely with chapter 2 from Queer Theory Now, From Pathology to Pride. So if you struggled with reading that chapter, this is a really good one to read after, and then to go back to that Queer Theory Now chapter, because I think it'll increase your understanding of what was being said. And I think that's a great way to start, because the very first section is all about how our understandings are contextual. So basically, that just means that there could be multiple meanings associated with what you're reading or learning about, which hopefully you're getting to understand is really the strength associated with this idea of being queer and queering as a verb. And so this selection of readings starts with some early sexologists, which is where a lot of people attribute the meaning to, or the word itself, of homosexuality or homosexual to those early sexologists and their studying. And then this leading to some of the earliest gay rights movements. And actually it's tied up with Freud as well. So there's a little section with Freud. And really, there are some limitations to what is discussed via Freud. And one of those is really this mature sexual aim of the PIV sex, which is penis and vagina sex, as being the norm or the gold standard of what sexual acts are supposed to embody. And that's talked a little bit about on page 22. And it's discussed even more with some early sex therapists. It's on page 23. That's Masters and Johnson. So this was kind of in the 1950s and 1960s. But again, it is the similar standard always being heterosexual relations, and very specifically that PIV standard of a sex act. And that's problematic when we're trying to break binaries and diversify experiences that people have. And so on page 25, we have a early discussion of the gay rights movement, and specifically what was talked about in chapter 2 of Queer Theory Now, the homophile movement, which is that assimilalist narrative, meaning that homosexual people are the same as heterosexual people, and we should be fighting for equal human rights based on that. But if you look at some of the smaller headings in some of the comic book section on this page, on page 25, you'll notice that they do rely a lot on this idea of homosexuality as a genetic disorder. That's the pathology aspect, but still fighting against the common barbaric cures, in quotations that were used in that same time period to control or to change people's behaviors. And so there are some really big problems with an assimilalist practice for gay rights, and those are discussed on page 26. So it's retaining the status quo and the dominant narrative of heterosexuality. There's an essentialist viewpoint going on, which means the opposite of what we're talking about with queering. It's a fixed identity, and that's not usually good. And then this, it's not my fault that I was like born this way kind of narrative being discussed in with it. And then the problematic faith of the movement being very white, middle class, educated gay men, and lesbian women, and the fact that that narrows the intersectionality that we've talked about before with the class. So there are three kind of commandment looking standards for what is becomes popular about the way we think about sex. And then the chapter or the selection that we're reading here does a really good job of breaking apart those key assumptions. So the first one being on page 28, that identities are fixed and essential. Remember, gender is fluid, sexuality is fluid, people's experiences can change with it over time. We're breaking apart binaries. That's a good thing. Number two, of course, that sexuality and gender is binary. These are binary ideas. And again, queer theory is questioning the whole concept of a binary. And then the key assumption number three on page 30 is that normal and abnormal sex can be distinguished from each other. And these binaries of normal, abnormal, good, bad, heterosexual, homosexual, those are all things that queer theory is breaking apart. And enter on page 31, queer theory. So now we're reaffirming some points that were already discussed in, I think, chapter 1 of queer theory now. And it's a lot of good points. Resisting the categorization of people, that you can put people into boxes and kind of figure them out and name them. Challenging the idea of essential identities, that people are born a certain way. You're either born a man or a woman, and your identity revolves around this fixed notion of what it means to be a man, of what it means to be a woman. And then, of course, questioning all those binaries. And so, remember, flux is good, movement is good. There are different academics and different activists and different theorists working with this multiplicity. Sometimes there's contradictions, sometimes there's disagreements, but the general overarching ideology is that life is complicated. There's no universal truth, and we're all kind of floundering out there trying to figure it out together, right? And then, so we have some precursors to queer theory that's talked a little bit about. I'm not going to read too much about the existentialists, but you can go and read about them yourselves on page 33. This includes Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir, and they're discussed on 34 and 35. And then Kinsey's sexual diversity. This is also talked about in chapter 2 of Queer Theory Now with the spectrum. And here you have a really nice graphic of 0 to 6, which is the scale that Kinsey used in determining and opening up our way of thinking about sexuality, of not being so fixed. But it's still, remember, everything is still very much scripted around heterosexual norms. We get into some discussion about androgyny on page 41 with Bem. And I think this was really exciting because Bem studies children and studies children who are able to be raised outside of a binary, and they learn that children internalize social gender roles, demonstrating that they are learned rather than innate. So remember, we script these when we encourage boys to play with dump trucks and girls to play with Barbies. And how do we undermine what we socially categorize each other with? And how do we move away from that? My favorite section is on page 42, and it goes on through really 47. So you have on 42 the Black feminists, the 60s and the 70s. This is all the civil rights movement, Black power, brown power. You have Black feminist thinkers that are criticizing the civil rights movement for not speaking towards gender enough, and then they're also critiquing the feminist movement for not discussing race aspects. And you have Audre Lorde that is briefly talked about on page 43, as well as Bell Hooks. And then Adrienne Rich is talked about on page 44. And she's really important because she brings us into critiquing social power in terms of normative rhetorics that we use. So that includes talking about heterosexuality when we're also talking about homosexuality, and how society kind of compels people into a heterosexual norm with this constant reinforcement of social scripts, right? Then as you continue on, I talked about Kimberly Crenshaw, and intersectionality. That is on page 47. So there's no one axis of oppression, but instead they intersect and compound or change one's experiences. And this includes race, gender, sexuality, class, etc., ableness. So that's very briefly touched upon on page 47. Then you have a couple of pages here about Gayle Rubin and their influential essay, Thinking Sex. That's started on page 48. And there's some really good graphics associated with that. And there are 6 points that Rubin uses, and it relates to the sex wars discussion in the feminist chapter in Queer Theory Now. So this is a really good section to read and go back to that chapter in the other textbook. It's on page 48 through 50. And then you're really caught up to, again, where we ended with the chapter 2 in Queer Theory Now, which is contemporary gay rights, queer activism, pride, and this is all emerging in the 1990s, and it's challenging the assimilist model that was very prevalent in the 1950s and whatnot with the homophiles, right? And so very briefly, Stonewall is referenced on page 51, and then the repercussions after Stonewall about the movement becoming very individualistic with a focus on personal coming out and being true to your identity and less on structural changes. And then there's a little discussion about HIV, AIDS, and activism on page 53, and we'll talk about that more in our next chapter in Queer Theory Now. And then finally, it ends with post-structuralism. And we've talked about this a little bit from Queer Theory Now, and mainly because people like Foucault and Butler are considered post-structuralist theorists. And that basically means that they reject the notion of a universal truth. So people that are out there in life and they're saying, tell me what is true and what isn't true and what I should believe. Well, post-structuralists are saying you can never uncover a single truth because it doesn't really exist. And that ground narratives just are structures of power. And so you have a little bit with Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, and then there is a very brief discussion on page 56 of Post-Structuralism 101. So it's all about deconstructing texts and breaking out or breaking open binaries. So, and not just breaking them apart, but determining which part of the binary is the privileged or more popular universal truth. And that's talked about on page 56, like I mentioned. And that leads us to subjectivity and how we can be social agents in our own understanding of ourself in relation to others in our outside world. And I really do like this image of an individual on page, I guess this is 57, in which they are choosing who they want to be in any given day and the power associated with a choice. So that kind of gives you a quick overview of what you should read and understand from the selections. And as always, if you have questions, you can reach out to me via Canvas email.